at USC. The fact that this season has fallen through the cracks, it really does make you, and it makes USC fans, I would think, appreciate that much more what Pete Carroll was able to do, in year 2, establishing a foundation and then building on that year 3 and 4 and having that 34 game winning streak. It all gives us an occasion to really, step back and say, this thing isn't easy, and having this ascendancy, even if you're a gifted, brilliant, talented play caller, schemer such as Lincoln Riley, it's not automatic. And this season's been a reminder of that. But in general, like you could tell when Pete Carroll established his footing at USC, like USC looked like an elite team when it took the field, and there was the occasional step on the rake moment in Corvallis, but like the week after a loss, USC would dump truck somebody 45-7, just complete focus, right back on the beam. Losses really felt like aberrational occurrences. It's not as though problems were allowed to fester and continue for a month and a half the way they have this season. Like, we know what elite teams look like, and we know that USC is not remotely close to that level of performance and that identity on the field.
I do, Matt, but you're bringing up year 2. Let's talk about year 2 with Pete Carroll. I mean, they lost to the Little Apple, right? They lost to Kansas State. Then they clunked one out against a Washington State team a couple weeks later. Now, that was just year 2, right? And then it was steamrolling from there. But we have to remember, this is just year 2 for Lincoln Riley. And maybe he overachieved. I mean, he even said that. He said, maybe, look, what we did, and because of Caleb Williams, maybe we really did this fan base a disservice. I know I got hooked. I mean, Mark knows I got hooked up in it. I was ready. I wanted to believe, after a decade of this crap, you guys, I wanted to believe we could pull this thing together so fast in Caleb's last year here. Because I knew how important it is to have a quarterback like Caleb. And I wanted it all to come together. Maybe we just decided, hey, we want him to compete with Georgia and Ohio State and Michigan. Programs have been building their program for how many years now? And we're yet 2 years away from Helton. I'm not, again, throw the stupid apologist comments into the statement. I'm spitting facts. Sometimes people need to slow down and say, yes, there is a transfer portal. But he's a year and a half into being here at USC. And we're saying, God damn it, no national championship. He's a bum. Fire him. He's going to NFL. He didn't show up for a press conference. Just all think he's going, the blah, blah. I mean, I think everybody, maybe he is just sick. Maybe that this team just wasn't ready. Maybe, just maybe, last year's offensive line was a very special offensive line with a generational quarterback that overachieved. So let's all try to take a deep breath on this, fans, and maybe realize that the sky isn't falling. Lincoln Riley, by the way, some of you guys, someone said, in the chat, I missed it. He hasn't won anything. Correct me if I'm wrong, you guys, but didn't this guy run the Big 12 for the better part of 6 years or something like that?
Yeah, anytime somebody makes that comment, one of two things is in play. Number one, they either have no idea what they're talking about, or number two, their standard of winning anything is just a national championship. And unless you win the national championship, you won nothing, you've done nothing, 0 counts. Yes, Lincoln Riley owned the Big 12 and had a remarkable record, one of the best in the country. I will make another note about last season, and that's that the schedule broke favorably for USC. No Washington, no Oregon, Notre Dame at home.
Yeah,
as opposed to this year.
Hey, guys, we got to catch up with super chat. Sorry, I've been very bad at this. We got a second to break for it. Eddie Chase, Riley has horrible leadership, brilliant offensive mind, but blind faith in a DC with zero history of consistent, solid play that is championship quality. Again, championship, you mean national championship? Because he was winning Big 12 championships. And yes, he would lost in the playoffs, but he lost to some, I don't know, guys, some pretty damn good teams he lost to in the playoffs. So, no, his defense, you're right. The guy has not figured out defense yet. No one can argue that. And apparently it looks like he still hasn't. Any thoughts on Eddie's comment?
Well, I would say, like most things, we would be in error if we would take one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum, like most people want to do. Lincoln Riley either making excuses for his playoff failures would be in the wrong category, but also just to say, oh, yeah, he just got blown out in the playoffs and didn't show up. No. As Tim, you note, often And it should be noted because Georgia in 2017 came within one play of winning a national championship. They took Alabama to overtime. They were arguably the best team in college football. And Oklahoma outplayed them and took them to double overtime at the Rose Bowl. So that was not, yes, technically that was, of course, that was a loss. And technically they did not succeed that season, but they could play with anyone, at least based on that one sample at the Rose Bowl in the playoff. Now, the other three outings, on one hand, they were clearly not up to the challenge in those three games, or I guess it would be two games. I'm throwing in the Bob Stoops playoff performance in 2015. So the games against LSU and Alabama, they were clearly not up to the challenge, but especially in the case of LSU and even the Alabama game going into their championship game against Clemson, they were considered an all-time great team. So they ran into two just NFL packed powerhouses, especially that LSU team in 19.
But like you said, we would be remiss we to say he has the same ability to build those defenses those programs had, and his defenses were just nowhere to be seen. Well, actually, the Alabama game, the early turnovers killed them, but in general, it really was just a lack of having a defense that could play championship football. So that part of it's correct. But to say Lincoln Riley, it doesn't have the culture or cannot win national championships, I'm sorry, it doesn't. It doesn't hold water with me. It just doesn't. Eddie, thank you again for another super chat. Any insight on current team morale? Is this players' fault or coaches that are responsible for this mess? The season could get ugly, sadly. Thoughts, Matt?
Well, I know that, Tim, your dad called into the show on Sunday, Papa Prangley, and it's always great hearing from him. And he's been a season ticket holder at USC for what, 57 years?
57 years, yeah.
He's been through it. He's been through Paul Hackett. He's been through Ted Tollner. He's been through all the ups and downs. He's been through, John McKay eating a 51-0
number
loss.
And J-Rob too. All of them, yeah.
Yeah. He's been through USC eating a 51-0 loss under McKay to Ara Parseghian and Notre Dame. He regaled us with a story about the aftermath of that game. And so, even great coaches such as John McKay, really took their lumps. Like USC wasn't good in 1960 and 1961, John McKay's first two seasons. In a modern context, if you don't do anything at USC in your first two seasons, like fans would be wanting you to be fired. But back then, of course, it was a more patient era. Like Dean Smith struggled his first several seasons as North Carolina's basketball coach. He was hung in effigy, but the administration had his back. He was allowed to find his footing. The rest is history. So McKay, if McKay in the modern era, he might not have been given time to build something at USC. But the larger point is that, even the greats have their really rough moments. And, Lincoln Riley, he wanted this thing to work with Alex Grinch. That he wanted to make this thing work with his friends, with his buddies, with the people that he enjoyed collaborating with. And I think that's part of the internal emotional crisis that Lincoln Riley's going through right now. I'm not predicting anything that he's going to do, but I think we can all agree he's going through it. He's going through the ringer. He's dealing with the frustration of failure on a comparatively larger scale. And when people say, and we've heard it all year, we've seen it all year in the chat, in the comments here at the Voice of College Football, how many times have you seen this? Both fans and critics from Oklahoma and elsewhere, they've said Lincoln Riley's never going to win a national title. He's never going to be championship level. And I'm not here to agree or disagree with that. I'm here to say that statement, and I think everyone in the room would agree, that statement is based on the belief. It's based on a belief, not on a fact. It's based on a belief that when you get right down to it, get down to brass tacks, he's not going to have the guts and the maturity to fire his friends. Like that is the belief on which the claims of Lincoln Riley never winning a title is based. But, when you look at what USC needs, when you look at what USC has to have in order to become that same championship program it was under Pete Carroll, that it was under McKay, that it was under John Robinson in the late 1970s. It's the enforcer who provides accountability in the inner sanctum, in the locker room. Now, Pete Carroll was himself a provider of that accountability, but also he had Ed Orgeron as kind of his enforcer, a guy who just wouldn't take crap from anybody. And of course, McKay and Robinson in the 60s and 70s, they had Marv Goo. He was the guy who would not put up with any BS from anyone. And he created a mentality and an attitude and a disposition where players would run through a brick wall for the coaches, but also like discipline was enforced. If you did not measure up, if you were not doing things the right way, you were put in your place. And you felt it and you knew it, and you did not want to be there. You did not want to be like that ever again, because Marv Goo would get in your face and he would tell you that you were not measuring up. So USC needs that. Lincoln Riley doesn't have that. And that's where we come to just the natural progression in all of this. Lincoln Riley has to be able and willing to fire Grinch, also fire strength coach Benny Wiley, and get some real tough MFers in the room, some real enforcers. And you can't just fire Grinch on an island. You have to also fire the strength coach. You have to get a real kick butt strength coach who's going to turn guys into tough football players. And so at Trojans Wire, we've gone over the defensive coordinator list. I mean, Alex Grinch hasn't been fired, but we should all be thinking about the kinds of names, the kinds of people that Lincoln Riley and also Jen Cohen should already be considering as replacements. Let's add this particular note. USC is not playing on Thanksgiving weekend. USC is playing the 9 straight games and then is off on Thanksgiving weekend. And we all hoped before the season that USC would make the Pac-12 title game and it would get that week off to rest, and USC would have an advantage in Vegas for the Pac-12 title game. Now that it seems that USC is not going to make the Pac-12 championship game, having the regular season end on November 18th could be a blessing. Lincoln Riley and Jen Cohen could get an extra time to vet candidates as the regular season is ending. They can look at what's happening in the rest of college football, and they can get an interview of prime defensive coordinator and strength coach candidates before other high-profile programs are able to do that. You think about other programs that might be considering changes, whether it's West Virginia or various other programs across the country that are going to fire head coaches or fire other notable assistants on their staffs because the season ends for USC November 18. That gives USC an extra week of time relative to the competition. So, in terms of needing to not only fire Alex Grinch, but make sure you get an elite replacement for him, USC is going to have a chance to get a number 1 top tier level candidate. But we have to see if Lincoln Riley has the maturity to make the tough calls. And we also have to see if Jen Cohen, who came into this job thinking, I'm going to be the AD of a successful national championship program. Things have really turned south, and she suddenly has, if not crisis management, she certainly has a complicated situation on her hands where it's not just that she has to make Lincoln Riley happy. Now she has to be a little bit of a bad cop and say, well, I want you to be happy, Lincoln, but you need to make changes. And how can we work together to make that happen? So Lincoln Riley and Jen Cohen are both under the gun to make some really tough calls in mid to late November.
So I'm going to assume that Lincoln Riley wants to win games. I'm going to assume that Lincoln Riley knows what's holding this team back. And I salute to Troy. I saw Sean Newell with his girls, and he was like a teddy bear with his kid. But you know what? Just like McKay and Robinson had Marv Goo, and Pete Carroll had Coach O. I think Sean Newell could. He's usually that defensive line guy, right? Yeah, I think he could actually be that guy that we're talking about. I don't know his demeanor. He just seems. I'm just stereotyping defensive line coaches. I don't know, Matt. I think there's just too much in the story plot about friendship stuff I keep hearing. I think it's a bunch of crap. Yeah, I think they're friends. Yeah, they come from a tree, at least tree going back to Washington State games with he was with Mike Leach.
Yeah.
I don't think a man who wants to put his stamp on and a legacy is going to be, well, he's my buddy, so I'm gonna go down to the ship. I don't think he's a Kirk Ferentz that kind of thing. I don't think that he's gonna, nepotism with his son and keep him on because he's his buddy. I just don't think that's gonna happen. I think that it was told to Grinch, here is our expectations. And I said to you a couple weeks ago, when he starts costing this team's wins, like they did on Saturday, the defense, absolutely. If this was Washington or Oregon, and you have a minute and 40 on there, and they march down and kick a field goal, it's like, yeah, you scored too quickly. But when this is the Utah offense and you allow them to march down the field and kick a field goal, then that was completely on the defense. And I think there will be change made. Adam, thank you again. Great supporter of the show. Everyone blames Grinch, but guys, we don't have the talent in the secondary. We don't get top recruits in the secondary. We don't have a winning culture. Firing Grinch won't solve these problems. And I agree. I don't think the entire problem is Grinch. However, I do believe that maybe his defense will work somewhere. Maybe it would work with, like I said, with lockdown NFL corners or just, all-American corners like we had Kelly and McCutcheon back in the 90s, right? If you had those guys that just NFL corners that lock people down, I think this defense would work. But with the current, like you're saying, with the secondary that we have, with the inability, I mean, I'm sure defensive ends in the NFL could run with a safety / running back that they had in Vaki. But with these college players and with the personnel USC has, this defense is not working. And we've watched it week in and week out where we've made teams and guys, unknown guys, into heroes that won games for the opposing teams.